November 8th, 1944. The Hürtgen Forest, Germany. 0400 hours, 23 degrees Fahrenheit, under a moonless sky that turned the forest into absolute darkness. The radio crackled with static, then a voice, calm, measured, the kind of calm that comes only from accepting what cannot be changed. Fire mission, grid coordinates 040379. Danger close. Repeat. Danger close. The artillery liaison officer 3 miles behind the lines stopped mid-sentence. Danger close meant American positions within 200 to 400 meters of impact. Standard procedure for desperate situations. This was not standard procedure. Confirm grid coordinates. 040379. That's our position. Germans are in our foxholes. Request fire for effect. 147 men of F&G companies, 12th Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division, had been fighting in the Hürtgen Forest for 36 hours. They had advanced 400 yards. They had lost 42 men. And now, cut off from all supply, surrounded by German infantry who had infiltrated through terrain so dense that you could not see 10 yards in any direction, they were about to do something the German defenders would later describe in captured documents as impossible to comprehend. They were going to call American artillery fire directly onto their own position. This is the story of how isolation bred innovation, how mathematics replaced doctrine, and why the desperate calculation of one forward observer transformed the German understanding of American willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of tactical objectives. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. At 0600 hours on November 7th, 1944, the 12th Infantry Regiment received orders that violated every principle of military common sense. They would conduct a night relief in place of the 109th Infantry Regiment, 28th Infantry Division, in the Hürtgen Forest. No reconnaissance, no daylight preparation, no coordination beyond verbal orders passed along a column of trucks sliding through mud on roads that barely qualified as trails. The 28th Division was shattered. 3 weeks in the forest had reduced their regiments to hollowed-out shells. Companies that began with 190 men reported strengths of 40. Platoons existed only on paper. Squad leaders commanded fire teams. The survivors moved with the blank expression of men who had learned that survival was random and preparation was irrelevant. Major General Raymond Barton, commanding the 4th Infantry Division, would later call the relief operation seldom equalled in the entire annals of military history. He was praising the logistical achievement. Moving 3,000 men through darkness on single-lane trails while maintaining noise discipline and avoiding German artillery observers represented staff work of the highest order. What he did not mention was that the operation also represented tactical insanity. Relief in place required detailed coordination, guides who knew the terrain, maps that showed defensive positions, communication plans that allowed incoming units to integrate with existing command structures. The 12th Infantry had none of these advantages. They had darkness, mud, and verbal instructions passed from one company commander to the next as the column moved forward. At 0200 hours on November 7th, the lead elements reached the detrucking point. German artillery had already found the road. Shells impacted randomly, guided by pre-registered coordinates rather than visual observation. The explosions lit up the forest in strobe flash sequences that turned trees into momentary silhouettes before plunging everything back into absolute darkness. The guides from the 109th Infantry appeared from the tree line. Most were privates or corporals, the only men left from their squads. They moved with the efficiency of exhaustion, speaking in monosyllables, pointing at trails that disappeared into blackness. The handoff happened in whispers. Your line runs from that tree to the stream bed. Krauts are 200 yards out, maybe closer. Mines everywhere. Good luck. By 12:50 hours on November 7th, the 12th Infantry, they occupied foxholes still warm from the previous occupants. They inherited fields of fire that had been cleared by men who were now evacuated or dead. They took control of a sector that extended from 1,000 meters west of Hurtgen village, running generally south to Germitte, a span of approximately 3 miles of forest so dense that adjacent platoons could not maintain visual contact. The terrain defied description by anyone who had not experienced it. Fir trees grew so tightly that their branches interlocked overhead, creating perpetual twilight even at midday. The forest floor was a tangle of underbrush, fallen logs, and ravines that appeared without warning. Trails existed only where engineers had cut them, and these firebreaks became German killing zones, pre-registered for artillery and covered by machine guns, positioned to exploit the only avenues of approach. Visibility at ground level measured 10 to 15 yards maximum. Sound was distorted by the density of trees. A German patrol moving 20 yards away could pass undetected. An artillery shell impacting 300 yards distant sounded immediate and close. The disorientation was psychological as much as physical. Men lost track of direction within minutes of leaving their foxholes. Compass bearings were useless without landmarks. The forest consumed spatial awareness and replaced it with claustrophobic confusion. German defensive doctrine in the Hürtgen Forest exploited these conditions with professional precision. General Lieutenant Hans Schmidt's 275th Infantry Division had been preparing positions since September. They knew every trail, every ravine, every clearing that might provide Americans with observation posts or artillery positions. They had placed mines not randomly but systematically, creating overlapping fields of denial that channeled American movement into predetermined killing zones. The Germans registered their artillery with meticulous attention. Every foxhole the Americans occupied, every trail they might use, every stream crossing that offered concealment had been plotted and recorded. German forward observers did not need to see targets. They called in coordinates from memory, knowing that shells would impact on American positions regardless of visibility or weather conditions. Tree bursts transformed German artillery from dangerous into devastating. Shells fused to detonate on contact with treetops, created downward cascading shrapnel patterns that negated the protection of foxholes. A soldier huddled beneath overhead cover might survive a normal artillery barrage. Tree bursts sent steel fragments and wooden splinters down into positions that offered no escape. The forest itself became weaponized. The 12th Infantry's mission was straightforward in concept and impossible in execution. Advance east through the forest, clear German positions, reach the edge of the woods overlooking Hürtgen village, support the larger divisional effort to break through to the Ruhr River and the vital dams that controlled water levels across the entire operational sector. On paper, the plan assumed that American advantages in artillery, air support, and logistics would overcome German defensive preparations. In practice, the forest neutralized every advantage. Artillery was effective only on the few trails and clearings. Air support could not identify targets through the canopy. Logistics meant hand-carrying supplies forward because vehicles could not navigate trails blocked by mines and destroyed by artillery. The attack began on November 8th at 0800 hours. F and G companies, 2nd Battalion, 12th Infantry, jumped off from their positions west of Hurtgen. Their objective was the woods east of the Hürtgen-Germitte road, a distance of approximately 800 yards through terrain that intelligence described as lightly defended with scattered resistance expected. The intelligence assessment was wrong. The Germans were not lightly defending. They were waiting. F Company, commanded by Captain William Morrison, advanced in a column of platoons through forest so dense that squad leaders lost visual contact with their point men within seconds. The company moved slowly, probing for mines, checking fallen logs for booby traps, scanning the undergrowth for movement that might indicate German positions. At 0840 hours, German machine guns opened, fire from positions so well camouflaged that American soldiers could not identify muzzle flashes. The MG-42, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute, created a wall of bullets that cut through underbrush and saplings with industrial efficiency. F Company went to ground, taking cover behind trees and in shallow depressions that provided concealment but no real protection. G Company, advancing 200 yards to F Company's right, hit the same wall of fire. German mortars began falling with practiced accuracy, walking their fire across the American positions in methodical progressions that forced entire squads to abandon cover and scatter into surrounding forest. Within 20 minutes, both companies had lost their forward momentum and were pinned down in small groups scattered across 400 yards of forest. The battalion commander attempted to coordinate supporting fire. Artillery forward observers called in coordinates, but the density of trees made adjustments impossible. Observers could not see where shells were landing. Corrections were made by sound and by reports from scattered infantry, who could not reliably identify their own positions. Artillery rounds fell, explosions echoed through the forest, and German resistance continued undiminished. By noon on November 8th, F and G companies had advanced 100 yards and suffered 20 casualties. The mathematics were brutal and obvious. At this rate, reaching the objective would cost both companies their entire strength before they closed half the distance. But the companies kept moving. Squad leaders identified machine gun positions by following tracer fire back to its source. Riflemen worked forward in teams, using covering fire to advance in short bounds that gained 5 or 10 yards at a time. German resistance was professional and unyielding, but it was not overwhelming. The defenders were inflicting casualties, but they were not stopping the American advance. By 1600 hours, both companies had pushed forward another 200 yards. They were now 400 yards from their line of departure, and perhaps 400 yards from their objective. German resistance had stiffened. Fresh enemy troops were being fed into the line, identifiable by the increase in machine gun fire and the coordinated mortar barrages that indicated experienced forward observers directing fire. At 1800 hours, as darkness turned the forest from dim to black, F and G companies consolidated their positions. They had gained 400 yards in 10 hours of continuous combat. They had lost 32 men killed or wounded. They had not reached their objective, but they had maintained momentum against prepared defensive positions in terrain that favoured the defender in every possible way. Captain Morrison assessed his situation with the cold calculation that separated effective officers from those who got their men killed pursuing unrealistic objectives. F. Company had started the day with 138 men. He now counted 96 effective. G Company, commanded by Captain Robert Henderson, reported similar losses. Together, the two companies had 189 men capable of continuing the attack. Supply was already problematic. The firebreak that served as the main supply route was under constant German artillery fire. Hand-carrying parties moved forward only after dark, and even then suffered casualties from tree bursts and random mortar fire. Ammunition was adequate for defensive operations, but insufficient for sustained attack. Food was cold, sea rations eaten from cans. Water came from streams that might be contaminated but represented the only source available. Communication with battalion headquarters relied on radio, and radio signals in the forest were unreliable. Transmissions faded in and out. Static from atmospheric conditions and German jamming attempts made voice communication difficult. Runners provided the only reliable means of passing information, but runners in the Hürtgen Forest moved at walking speed through darkness and faced the same mine and artillery hazards as everyone else. At 2200 hours, battalion headquarters sent forward new orders. F and G companies would resume the attack at 0800 hours on November 9th. Artillery preparation would commence at 0730 hours. Armour support was not available. The trail network would not support tanks, and engineers had not yet cleared mines from the firebreaks. Morrison and Henderson made their plans without illusion. They would attack with approximately 190 men across terrain that offered no cover and against an enemy that had spent the night reinforcing positions and registering new artillery coordinates. The objective remained the same: woods east of the Hurtgen road. The timeline remained unchanged: advance as quickly as possible to support the larger divisional effort. Neither officer mentioned what both understood. The attack would succeed only if German resistance collapsed, and German resistance showed no sign of collapsing. The attack would cost casualties that neither company could sustain, and those casualties would be replaced by men straight from training who had never experienced combat. The mathematics were unforgiving, and the mathematics predicted failure. But orders were orders, and the attack would proceed. November 9th dawned, with the same grey overcast that had dominated weather for weeks. Temperature remained in the low 20s Fahrenheit. A light drizzle began falling at 0600 hours, not heavy enough to provide concealment but sufficient to soak through uniforms and create the bone-deep cold that sapped energy and morale. The artillery preparation began precisely at 0730 hours. American 105mm howitzers, firing from positions 3 miles behind the lines, dropped shells onto German positions identified by coordinates supplied by forward observers the previous day. The barrage lasted 15 minutes, 180 shells that tore through the forest canopy and created tree bursts across the German defensive line. At 0800 hours, F and G companies advanced. They moved in squad rushes, one fire team providing covering fire while another bounded forward. German response was immediate and heavy. Machine guns that should have been neutralized by the artillery barrage opened fire from positions that showed no damage. Mortars began falling within minutes, walking their fire across the American line with accuracy that indicated experienced observers and pre-registered coordinates. By 0900 hours, the attack had stalled. F Company had advanced 50 yards and lost 12 men. G Company reported 15 casualties and no forward progress. German resistance was not weakening. If anything, it was intensifying as fresh. Troops moved into positions and additional weapons were brought forward. Captain Morrison called for artillery support. Forward observers adjusted fire, bringing shells closer to the American positions in an attempt to suppress German machine guns that were firing from ranges of 100 yards or less. The danger close threshold 200 to 400 meters from friendly positions had been crossed, but the situation demanded risks that normal safety protocols would prohibit. By 1000 hours, American artillery had shifted to within 150 meters of F Company's forward positions. Shells were landing so close that American soldiers could feel concussion through the ground and had to hunker down in their foxholes to avoid shrapnel from their own supporting fire. German resistance began to weaken, not from casualties but from the psychological impact of sustained high-explosive bombardment at close range. F and G companies pushed forward, exploiting the brief window when German fire slackened. They gained another 100 yards, closing to within 300 yards of their objective. German resistance stiffened again as defenders recovered from the artillery barrage and resumed coordinated fire. The pattern repeated. American advance under covering fire, German resistance intensifies, American artillery adjusts closer, temporary suppression allows brief advance, German resistance resumes. By 1400 hours on November 9th, both companies had reached a position approximately 250 yards from their objective. They had been in continuous combat for 30 hours. They had advanced 400 yards total. They had lost 62 men killed or wounded. The remaining 147 soldiers were exhausted, low on ammunition, and increasingly isolated from their supporting elements. The main supply route, the firebreak they depended on for ammunition, food, and medical evacuation, was now under Ferry 8. Such heavy German artillery fire that hand-carrying parties could not get through. German infantry had infiltrated around the American flanks, occupying positions that cut off direct routes back to battalion headquarters. F and G companies were not yet surrounded, but they were increasingly cut off from support. At 1600 hours, German artillery began a systematic bombardment of the American positions. The shells came in salvos of 6 to 8 rounds, timed to catch soldiers between the explosions when they emerged from cover. Tree bursts created shrapnel patterns that filled the forest with steel fragments and wooden splinters. Men who had survived the advance found themselves pinned in foxholes, unable to move, taking casualties from artillery fire they could neither avoid nor return. By 1800 hours, the situation had deteriorated beyond sustainable limits. F Company reported 73 effective soldiers. G Company counted 74. Together, they had 147 men holding positions that were supposed to be defended by 2 full companies, totaling 380. German infantry was probing their flanks, testing for weak points, preparing for the counterattack that both company commanders knew was coming. Captain Morrison attempted to contact battalion headquarters by radio. The signal faded in and out, made worse by German jamming attempts and the interference created by the dense forest. He got through long enough to report his position and request instructions. The response was brief. Hold your positions. Reinforcements moving forward. No reinforcements would reach them that night. The trails were blocked by German infiltrators. The firebreak was under constant artillery fire. Any movement would draw immediate German response. F and G companies were effectively isolated, holding a position that doctrine said required at least battalion strength, with approximately half the combat power of 2 understrength rifle companies. As darkness fell on November 9th, the Germans began their counterattack. It started with artillery, a sustained barrage that lasted 20 minutes and forced every American soldier into the bottom of their foxholes. Then came the infantry, moving through the forest in small groups, infiltrating between American positions, seeking gaps in the defensive line. The fighting devolved into close-range firefights between men who could barely see each other in the darkness. Muzzle flashes provided the only illumination. Germans appeared at distances of 10 or 20 yards, too close for effective rifle fire, close enough that grenades became the primary weapon. American soldiers threw fragmentation grenades into the darkness, listening for explosions that might indicate hits, hearing German voices calling out in coordination as they maneuvered through positions they had reconnoitred during daylight. F Company's left flank collapsed first. A German assault team broke through between 2 squads, killing 3 men and forcing the survivors to fall back 20 yards to a secondary position. G Company's center platoon reported Germans in their foxholes, hand-to-hand fighting in darkness so complete that soldiers recognized friend from foe only by voice and silhouette. Captain Morrison made the calculation that every isolated commander faces: withdraw to defensible positions and risk losing all momentum, or hold current positions and accept casualties that might render both companies' combat ineffective. The decision was made easier by the fact that withdrawal was no longer possible. German infantry was between his companies and the battalion lines. Any movement would expose his men to fire from both directions. F and G companies would hold their positions. They would fight through the night, and they would call for artillery support at ranges that doctrine said were suicidal. At 2100 hours on November 9th, 1944, Lieutenant Daniel Parker, forward observer attached to F Company, established radio contact with the 44th Field Artillery Battalion. His voice was steady, professional, carrying none of the stress that his situation warranted. Fire mission. Coordinates 040379. German infantry, attacking from north and east. Estimate company strength. Request immediate suppression. The Fire Direction Center responded within seconds. Confirm coordinates 040379. Confirmed. Those coordinates are our current position. Germans are in our perimeter. Request fire danger close, 100 meters. There was a pause. In the Fire Direction Center, 3 miles behind the lines, artillery officers were processing a request that violated every safety regulation. Danger close was defined as fire within 200 to 400 meters of friendly troops. Parker was requesting fire at 100 meters, a distance at which American soldiers would be well within the casualty radius of 105mm high explosive shells. Understand request for fire at 100 meters from friendly position. Confirm you understand risk of friendly casualties. Parker's response entered into the historical record, preserved in the 44th Field Artillery Battalion's logs. Affirmative. We're taking casualties now. If we don't get fire support, we won't be here in 30 minutes. Fire for effect. The first salvo landed at 2100 hours. 6 rounds, high explosive, fused for tree burst impact. They detonated 100 meters north of F Company's positions, creating a wall of shrapnel and concussion that caught German infantry in the open. The explosions lit up the forest in brilliant flashes that temporarily destroyed the night vision of everyone within 300 meters. Parker adjusted fire, walking the barrage in a line that traced the German assault route. Drop 50 meters. Fire for effect. The next salvo landed closer, 75 meters from American positions. Soldiers in F Company's foxholes felt the concussion through the ground. Shrapnel and wood fragments landed in their positions. 2 men suffered minor wounds from friendly fire. The German attack stopped. For the next 3 hours, Lieutenant Parker directed artillery fire in a pattern that created a protective barrier around F and G Company's positions. He called fire as close as 50 meters from American foxholes, adjusting by sound and by reports from squad leaders who could see German movement silhouetted against the explosions. The artillery battalion fired over 600 rounds, creating a continuous barrage that prevented German infantry from organizing coordinated attacks. German soldiers who survived the bombardment and were captured the following day described the experience in interrogation reports that revealed their psychological state. They had expected American artillery support at normal ranges 300 to 600 meters from friendly positions. They had not anticipated artillery fire that landed among both American and German soldiers indiscriminately. The captured Germans used phrases like "fighting madmen" and "willingness to die with us" to describe American tactical doctrine. What the Germans perceived as madness was actually mathematics. Parker was calculating casualty rates in real time, weighing known losses against projected losses. Without artillery support, German infantry would overrun both companies within an hour, resulting in 100% casualties among the 147 American soldiers still effective. With artillery support at danger close range, American casualties from friendly fire might reach 10 to 15%, but German casualties would be sufficient to stop the attack. The calculation was brutal and simple. Accept certain losses from friendly fire to prevent total losses from enemy action. At midnight on November 9th, the German counterattack ended. Parker ceased fire, conserving ammunition, and giving both sides a break from the continuous noise and concussion. F and G companies counted their casualties. 9 men had been wounded by American artillery fragments, 3 seriously enough to require evacuation that would not come until daylight. German casualties, estimated from body counts conducted the next morning, exceeded 50 killed and wounded, most from artillery fire called in at ranges that German doctrine considered impossible. Captain Morrison's assessment, filed in his after-action report 3 days later, captured the situation with professional brevity. Artillery support at danger close range proved decisive in repelling enemy counterattack. Friendly casualties from artillery were acceptable given the alternative of being overrun. Forward observer performance under extreme conditions was exemplary. The night of November 9th to 10th passed in tense vigilance. German probes continued. Small groups testing American positions, seeking gaps in the defensive line. Each probe was met with rifle fire, grenades, and immediate calls for artillery that landed within 100 meters of American foxholes. The psychological impact on German troops was significant. They had been trained to exploit the period between artillery barrages when American infantry was isolated and vulnerable. Now there was no such period. Artillery fire came immediately upon request, landing so close to American positions that German attackers found themselves caught between American rifles and American artillery with no safe distance to exploit. By dawn on November 10th, F and G companies remained in their positions, still isolated, still cut off from supply, but still holding ground that doctrine said they should have abandoned. They had suffered total casualties of 79 men over 3 days, approximately 40% of their starting strength. German casualties in their sector exceeded 120, most inflicted by artillery fire called in at ranges that safety regulations prohibited. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. At 0600 hours on November 10th, American engineers from Charlie Company, 4th Engineers, began clearing mines along the firebreak that served as the main supply route. The work proceeded slowly under German artillery fire, but by 0900 hours, a narrow corridor had been cleared sufficient to allow hand-carrying parties to reach F and G Company's positions. Ammunition arrived first. Rifle rounds, machine gun belts, mortar shells, and grenades were distributed to depleted stocks. Medics evacuated wounded soldiers who had been lying in foxholes for 2 days. Food supplies, still limited to sea rations, provided the first hot meal in 72 hours when soldiers heated cans over. Small fires that they hoped would not draw German attention. Captain Henderson, commanding G Company, used the brief respite to reorganize his remaining platoons into 2 effective combat teams. Squad leaders assumed command of platoons. Privates led fire teams. The company structure existed only on paper, but the combat capability remained functional through the individual competence of soldiers who had learned to fight as small units without elaborate coordination. At 1200 hours, battalion headquarters radioed new orders. F and G companies would be relieved in place by elements of the 1st Battalion, which would continue the attack toward the objective. The relief would occur after dark to minimize German observation and artillery fire. F and G companies would withdraw to positions 800 yards behind the current line and enter division reserve for rest and reconstitution. The relief operation began at 1800 hours under the cover of artillery preparation that convinced German observers an attack was imminent. While German defenders braced for assault, American soldiers moved quietly through the forest, new troops taking over foxholes from exhausted veterans who provided whispered instructions about fields of fire, German positions, and the location of mines that had been marked but not cleared. By 2200 hours, the relief was complete. F and G companies moved back through the forest in single file, following guides who knew the cleared routes. German artillery followed their movement, shells impacting along trails with the precision that came from weeks of registering coordinates. The companies suffered 3 more casualties during the withdrawal, men who had survived 3 days of continuous combat only to be killed moving to safety. The 1st Battalion resumed the attack on November 11th and reached the objective by nightfall. They advanced the final 250 yards that F and G companies had been unable to close, taking advantage of weakened German resistance that reflected casualties inflicted by 3 days of continuous artillery fire. The cost was 43 additional American casualties, bringing the total for the operation to 122 killed or wounded to gain 800 yards of forest. The 12th Infantry Regiment's after-action report, compiled by Major Frederick Kent, Regimental S4, analysed the operation with the clinical detachment required by military doctrine. The report noted that F and G companies had been completely isolated by German penetrations that cut their supply route. It documented that both companies maintained defensive positions under continuous enemy pressure for 60 hours without reinforcement. It recorded that artillery fire at danger close range proved decisive in repelling multiple enemy counterattacks. What the after-action report did not capture was the psychological dimension of the engagement. German prisoners, interrogated after the battle, consistently expressed confusion about American tactical doctrine. They understood artillery support for infantry attacks. They expected defensive artillery fire at standard safe distances from American positions. They could not comprehend why American commanders would call artillery fire onto their own positions, accepting friendly casualties to inflict enemy casualties at even greater rates. The German assessment, preserved in captured documents from the 275th Infantry Division, described American tactics as reckless but effective. German intelligence officers, analyzing the engagement, concluded that American willingness to accept casualties through danger-close artillery fire indicated either exceptional confidence in artillery accuracy or a level of desperation that suggested broader problems with American combat effectiveness. Both assessments were partially correct and fundamentally wrong. American artillery accuracy in the Hürtgen Forest was adequate but not exceptional. Tree bursts created unpredictable shrapnel patterns that made precise fire control impossible. Forward observers adjusted fire by sound and by fragmentary reports from scattered infantry positions. The margin of error was significant, and friendly casualties from artillery fire were inevitable at the ranges Lieutenant Parker was calling. American desperation was real, but not the desperation of weakness. F and G companies were not collapsing. They were holding positions that doctrine said required twice their strength against counterattacks that should have overwhelmed their defensive capabilities. The desperation was tactical, not psychological, the recognition that conventional artillery support at safe distances would not provide sufficient firepower to stop German attacks. What German analysis missed was the industrial calculation underlying American tactical decisions. The United States Army in November 1944 could sustain casualties at rates that would cripple Wehrmacht formations. American replacement systems could feed fresh troops into depleted companies within days. American logistics could deliver unlimited artillery ammunition to forward positions. American industrial capacity meant that accepting friendly casualties from close artillery support was sustainable in ways that German forces could not match. Lieutenant Parker's artillery fire on the night of November 9th consumed 600 rounds of 105mm ammunition. American factories were producing that quantity every 12 minutes around the clock. The 44th Field Artillery Battalion's ammunition stocks were replenished within 24 hours. German artillery batteries, limited by production shortfalls and disrupted supply lines, rationed ammunition, and could not match sustained fire rates that American artillery maintained indefinitely. The mathematics of attrition favored American tactical doctrine, even when that doctrine included accepting friendly casualties from danger-close artillery fire. F and G companies suffered 9 casualties from American artillery over 3 days. They inflicted estimated German casualties exceeding 120 through combination of rifle fire and artillery support. The casualty exchange ratio, approximately 13-1 in favor of American forces, represented sustainable attrition from the American perspective and unsustainable losses for German defenders. This calculation would prove decisive not just in the Hürtgen Forest, but across the entire Western Front. American commanders learned that close artillery support, even at ranges that caused friendly casualties, provided firepower advantages that German forces could not counter. Forward observers became increasingly aggressive in calling fire missions, adjusting shells to within 100 meters of American positions when tactical situations demanded maximum suppressive fire. The Germans never developed effective countermeasures. Their doctrine emphasized artillery fire at safe distances from friendly troops, preserving German combat power at the cost of reduced firepower effectiveness. German forward observers who suggested American-style danger-close fire missions faced rebuke from commanders who viewed friendly casualties from artillery fire as unacceptable regardless of tactical benefits. By December 1944, when the Battle of the Bulge brought the next major engagement on the Western Front, German intelligence assessments included specific warnings about American artillery doctrine. Forward observers were instructed to expect American artillery at ranges of 100 meters or less from American infantry positions. German troops were told that closing to hand grenade range with American infantry no longer provided safety from artillery fire. These warnings proved accurate but provided no solution. German infantry attempting to exploit gaps in American lines found themselves caught between rifle fire and artillery barrages that American forward observers called onto positions where German and American soldiers were intermingled. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers who had learned to exploit the brief periods between artillery barrages when American infantry was isolated found no such periods existed. Artillery fire was continuous, immediate, and called at ranges that made survival more dependent on luck than on tactical skill. The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest officially ended on December 16, 1944, when German forces launched the Ardennes offensive and forced Allied commanders to redirect forces from the forest to counter the breakthrough. The 12th Infantry Regiment had been in continuous combat for 39 days. Total casualties exceeded 1,600 killed, wounded, or missing approximately 50% of the regiment's assigned strength. The 4th Infantry Division, which entered the Hürtgen Forest on November 6, with approximately 14,000 effective combat soldiers, emerged on December 16 with fewer than 8,000 men still capable of frontline duty. The division had suffered casualties that would have rendered most Wehrmacht divisions combat ineffective and requiring months of reconstitution. The 4th Division was pulled from the line, given 2 weeks of rest, refitted with replacement soldiers, and committed to defensive positions in the Ardennes, where it would help stop the German offensive. This resilience reflected the industrial and demographic advantages that defined American military capability in 1944. The United States could sustain casualty rates that would cripple German formations, because American replacement systems could absorb losses and maintain unit effectiveness through continuous infusion of trained personnel. German replacement systems, strained by years of attrition warfare on multiple fronts, could not match this capability. F and G companies of the 12th Infantry Regiment spent 2 weeks in reserve following their isolation in the Hürtgen Forest. During that period, they received 115 replacement soldiers to bring the companies back to 75% of authorized strength. The replacements were mostly 19- and 20-year-old soldiers, fresh from training camps in the United States, men who had never experienced combat, arriving to replace veterans who had learned survival through 60 hours of continuous fighting in the worst terrain the U.S. Army encountered in Western Europe. The integration of replacements into veteran units presented challenges that after-action reports documented but could not fully capture. Replacements lacked the tactical knowledge that veterans had acquired through combat experience. They did not know how to read the forest for signs of German observation posts. They had not developed the instinctive recognition of incoming artillery by sound. They moved too quickly or too slowly, made noise at wrong moments, forgot to check overhead for tree burst danger. Company commanders assigned replacements to veteran squads where experienced soldiers could provide mentorship and supervision. The veterans accepted this responsibility with resignation rather than enthusiasm. They knew that many replacements would become casualties before they developed combat skills. They knew that forming emotional attachments to soldiers who might not survive their first week in combat was psychologically draining. But they also knew that unit cohesion required integration, and integration required veterans to teach survival skills that no training program could fully duplicate. By late December, when the 4th Infantry Division moved to defensive positions in the Ardennes, F and G companies had absorbed their replacements and rebuilt unit cohesion sufficient for continued combat operations. The process took 2 weeks and cost additional casualties, as replacements learned through experience what training had been unable to teach. But the companies remained combat effective, and the 4th Division returned to frontline duty with confidence that its infantry regiments could hold positions against German attacks. Lieutenant Parker, the forward observer who had called artillery fire onto his own position during the isolation of F and G companies, received no medal for his actions. His performance was noted in after-action reports with brief professional praise. Forward observer displayed exceptional skill in coordinating fire support under extreme conditions. No further recognition followed. In the U.S. Army of 1944, calling danger close artillery fire had become sufficiently routine that it no longer qualified as extraordinary heroism worthy of decoration. This normalization of danger close artillery doctrine reflected broader changes in CENTPT, American tactical thinking during the Hürtgen Forest campaign. Commanders learned that infantry could not advance through defended forest without artillery support at ranges that safety regulations had previously prohibited. Forward observers learned to adjust fire by sound and by fragmentary reports rather than by visual observation. Infantry soldiers learned to remain in foxholes during danger-close fire missions, accepting the risk of friendly casualties to gain the suppressive effect necessary for survival against German counterattacks. These lessons, purchased at the cost of thousands of casualties in the Hürtgen Forest, became standardized doctrine in American infantry training by early 1945. Forward observer training programs incorporated exercises in calling fire at 100-meter ranges from friendly positions. Infantry training included instruction on coordinating with artillery support at danger-close distances. Safety regulations were modified to permit commanders to authorize fire missions inside minimum safe distances when tactical situations required maximum suppressive firepower. German defenders captured in subsequent engagements continued to express confusion about American artillery doctrine. Interrogators documented consistent themes in prisoner statements. Americans called artillery fire closer to their own positions than German safety regulations permitted. American forward observers adjusted fire more aggressively than German observers. American infantry remained in positions during artillery barrages that German troops would have evacuated as too dangerous. These observations led German intelligence officers to conclude that American artillery doctrine reflected either superior fire control technology or inferior regard for soldier welfare. Both conclusions missed the fundamental calculation underlying American tactics. Danger-close artillery fire was not about technology or callousness. It was about mathematics. F and G. Company's isolation in the Hürtgen Forest demonstrated that accepting friendly casualties from artillery fire at 100-meter ranges prevented higher casualties from being overrun by German infantry. The exchange ratio 9 friendly casualties from artillery versus 50-plus German casualties represented mathematics that favored aggressive artillery doctrine even when that doctrine caused American casualties. This calculation extended beyond individual engagements to strategic attrition across the entire Western Front. American industrial capacity could produce unlimited artillery ammunition. American demographic advantages could sustain higher casualty rates than German forces. American logistics could deliver fire support to forward positions regardless of terrain or weather conditions. These advantages meant that aggressive artillery doctrine, including danger-close fire missions, provided cumulative benefits that outweighed the costs of friendly casualties. The Germans never developed countermeasures, because countermeasures would have required matching American industrial and logistical capabilities that Germany could not duplicate by late 1944. German artillery could not sustain fire rates that American artillery maintained as routine. German replacement systems could not absorb casualties at rates that American formations sustained without loss of combat effectiveness. German tactical doctrine, developed for wars of maneuver where artillery provided support at safe distances, could not adapt to attritional warfare where artillery became the primary weapon system regardless of safety considerations. In the Hürtgen Forest, these doctrinal differences manifested in tactical outcomes that defined the battle's character. American formations suffered horrific casualties but maintained offensive pressure through continuous artillery support. German formations inflicted heavy losses but could not prevent American advances because they lacked the firepower to suppress American artillery-supported attacks. The forest became a killing ground where both sides paid enormous costs, but American capacity to sustain losses exceeded German capacity to inflict them. F and G Company's 60-hour isolation, sustained through artillery fire called at ranges that caused friendly casualties, represented this dynamic in microcosm. The companies survived not through superior tactics or heroic individual actions, but through industrial mathematics. They had access to artillery support that could deliver 600 rounds in 3 hours. They had forward observers willing to call fire at 100-meter ranges. They had soldiers trained to remain in positions during danger-close barrages. These capabilities, multiplied across the entire American army, created tactical advantages that German forces could recognize but not counter. By February 1945, when American forces finally cleared the Hürtgen Forest and pushed beyond the Ruhr River toward the Rhine, the lessons learned from engagements like F and G Company's isolation had been incorporated throughout U.S. Army doctrine. Artillery forward observers routinely called fire at ranges that would have been prohibited 6 months earlier. Infantry commanders planned operations assuming danger close artillery support as standard rather than exceptional. Safety regulations acknowledged that tactical necessity sometimes required accepting friendly casualties from supporting fire. The Germans recognized these changes through bitter experience. Prisoners captured in the final months of the war consistently described American artillery as the most dangerous threat they faced. They reported that American artillery fire came faster, lasted longer, and fell closer to American positions than German doctrine considered possible. They noted that American infantry did not withdraw when their own artillery fired danger-close missions, but instead remained in positions and exploited the suppressive effect to advance during barrages. These observations, documented in intelligence reports that survived the war, revealed the psychological impact of American artillery doctrine on German combat effectiveness. German soldiers, who knew that American artillery might land on positions where German and American troops were intermingled, faced calculation that German training had not prepared them for. Closing to hand grenade range with American infantry no longer provided safety from artillery fire. The brief period between artillery barrages when infantry could maneuver without suppression no longer existed reliably. The forest that had been Germany's strongest defensive terrain became indefensible against tactics that accepted friendly casualties to achieve overwhelming firepower advantages. German veterans who survived the Hürtgen Forest and were redeployed to other sectors carried with them the psychological burden of knowing that American artillery could not be avoided by any tactical maneuver German doctrine recognized as valid. The final accounting of the Hürtgen Forest campaign recorded casualties that shocked even hardened military analysts. American forces suffered approximately 33,000 battle casualties, and an additional 9,000 non-battle casualties from trench foot, frostbite, and combat fatigue. German casualties totaled approximately 28,000 killed, wounded, or missing. The forest had been cleared at a cost that exceeded any other single engagement the U.S. Army fought in Western Europe. Within those statistics, F and G Company's isolation represented a footnote, 2 companies among hundreds that fought in the forest, 60 hours among months of continuous combat. The company's survival through danger-close artillery fire merited brief mention in after-action reports, but generated no extensive analysis or doctrinal studies. Yet the tactical innovation that Lieutenant Parker demonstrated on the night of November 9th, calling artillery fire onto his own position to stop German counterattacks, became standard procedure for American forward observers for the remainder of the war. The calculation he made, accepting certain friendly casualties to prevent higher losses from being overrun, became embedded in U.S. Army artillery doctrine and remains part of fire support planning to the present day. The Germans never forgot what they learned in the Hürtgen Forest. Captured German officers interrogated after the war, when asked to identify the most significant American tactical advantage, consistently cited artillery support. Not artillery quantity, though American artillery outnumbered German guns significantly. Not artillery accuracy, though American fire control systems were superior. They cited artillery doctrine, the willingness of American commanders to call fire at ranges that caused friendly casualties to achieve tactical objectives. This willingness, born from desperation in isolated positions like those held by F and G companies, reflected an industrial calculation that defined modern warfare. Armies with unlimited ammunition could accept casualties from friendly fire to achieve firepower advantages that armies with limited resources could not match. Soldiers with confidence that replacements would arrive within days could sustain losses that would render other armies' combat ineffective. Forward observers with training and authorization to call danger-close missions could provide fire support that observers constrained by safety regulations could not duplicate. F and G companies had survived 60 hours of isolation by demonstrating these advantages in their most extreme form. They called artillery fire at 100 meters from their own positions. They accepted friendly casualties from tree-burst shrapnel. They maintained defensive positions during barrages that German soldiers would have considered suicidal to remain through. And they survived, not through individual heroism or tactical brilliance, but through industrial mathematics that favored American doctrine over German limitations. The forest eventually gave way to open ground beyond the Ruhr River. The 12th Infantry Regiment advanced with other 4th Division units toward the Rhine and eventual penetration into Germany. F and G companies, reconstituted with replacements and returned to combat effectiveness, participated in operations that ended with German surrender in May 1945. Few veterans of those companies discussed their 60 hours of isolation in the Hürtgen Forest. The experience was too recent, too traumatic, too filled with memories of friends killed by artillery fire, called onto positions where the distinction between friendly and enemy casualties disappeared in the mathematics of survival. But they carried with them the knowledge that they had discovered something fundamental about modern warfare. That firepower could substitute for manpower when industrial capacity permitted unlimited ammunition expenditure, that accepting friendly casualties from supporting fire was mathematically preferable to avoiding friendly casualties while being overrun by enemy infantry, that the calculus of war in 1944 favored armies willing to trade immediate casualties for long-term attrition advantages. The Germans in the Hürtgen Forest learned this lesson by experiencing its consequences. They fought with skill, courage, and professional competence that the 12th Infantry Regiment's after-action reports acknowledged with respect. But they could not overcome the industrial and doctrinal advantages that American forces deployed with increasing confidence as the war progressed. One radio call on the night of November 9, 1944, one forward observer calling artillery fire onto his own position. One calculation that friendly casualties from artillery fire were acceptable if those casualties prevented higher losses from enemy action. The Germans could not believe it, but they could not stop it. And in the mathematics of industrial warfare, belief mattered less than the brutal calculus of production, logistics, and willingness to accept costs that doctrine had previously considered unacceptable. The forest took its toll. The companies survived. The war moved forward. And the lessons learned in 60 hours of isolation became doctrine that defined American artillery support for decades to come. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.